with that being said, you're going to have particular SOPs you need to write, for our PCQI community out there of how you're going to handle those. Here we go again. Hello again, PCQI, and thank you for joining us in our All About Compliance channel. In this segment, we're going to be discussing how to evaluate the safety of flood-affected food crops. Now, this topic, there's going to be a reference link on the description. Basically, it's a guidance for industry evaluating the safety of flood-affected food crops for human consumption from FDA. So we're going to add that. Now, some of these things I'm not going to cover the whole guidance. Obviously, it's just a quick summary for our PCQI family out there. So if you are in that type of category, and I'm sure you're aware of this, and if not, you'll be able to take a look at that link, and it'll give you the detailed guidance from FDA. So let's begin. So how to evaluate the safety of flood-affected food crops for human consumption? Basically, the guidance applies to all food crops. Specifically, the guidance provides guidance on safety of food crops when floodwaters contacted the edible portion of the crops, safety of food crops when floodwaters did not contact the edible portion of the crops, assessment of flood-affected fields before replanting, and additional controls to avoid cross-contamination after flooding. So assuring the safety of flood-affected food crops for human consumption is the responsibility of the growers that produce and market these crops. The recommendation in the guidance do not change the applicability of other federal or state regulations or the grower's responsibility to comply with those regulations. Now, this guidance restates existing FDA position as described in FDA documents on the safety of flood-affected food crops and include additional information to help growers assess the safety of food from flood-affected crops for human consumption. So there's a lot of guidance that they listed out. We'll put them in the description, and we'll cover some of those in this topic we have. So part of the guidance that they have, or the scope of it, is to minimize microbial food safety hazards of leafy greens. FDA also to growers, food manufacturers, food warehouse managers, and transporters for food products about the safety of food affected by hurricanes, flooding, and power outages. All right, now for our folks in California, there's also a letter to California firms that grow, pack, process, or ship fresh and fresh cut lettuces, which is on reference 3 of the guidance if you are going to browse through it. Now, the guidance documents, including the guidance that they are referring to here, do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities per FDA. Instead, the guidance describe the agency's current thinking on the topic and should be viewed only as recommendation unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. The use of the word should in agency guidances means that something is suggested or recommended but not required. Okay. So they put a background on this guidance, as many guidance have these, and let's read some of those. So this is flooding is the flowing or overflowing of field with water outside growers' control. Pooled water, such as after rainfall, that is not reasonably likely to cause contamination of the edible portion of the fresh produce is not considered flooding. Flooding events can present a potential hazardous public health risk. In some areas, crops may be submerged in floodwater, which may have been exposed to sewage, chemicals, heavy metals, pathogenic microorganisms, or other contaminants. Even if the crop is not completely submerged, there may still be microbial contamination of the edible portion of the crop. There's also the potential for plants to take up chemical contaminants. In addition to the direct presence of contaminants noted above, mold and toxins may develop in the crop as a result of exposure to the water. Now, with that being said, as PCQI, there is going to be some regulatory requirements, which in this guidance that they're put as a requirement. One of those is safety of food crops when floodwaters contacted the edible portion of the crops. Okay, so if the edible portion of a crop is exposed to floodwater, it's considered adulterated under the Section 402A, subsection 4, and 21 USC Code 342, Section A4. Okay, so with that being said, so if it's flooded, there's no recouping it. Okay, so that's basically that's what the main part of the evaluation of that. Now, the recommendation by FDA in this section of the guide basically says you need to dispose of the crop in a manner that ensures they are kept separate from other crops, have not been flood damaged, or to avoid adulterating the clean crops. So you're gonna have to quarantine those and have your disposal procedures, whatever those SOPs are, okay? The food crops that is listed, let me go over those, is surface crops such as leafy greens, tomatoes, string beans, berries, and corn. Underground crops such as peanuts, potatoes, carrots, and garlic. Crops with hard outer skin or shell such as watermelon and winter squash. Grain, nuts, corn, and similar products stored in bulk, okay? So that's what the Section A that applies. Now let's go to Section B, safety of food crops when floodwaters did not contact edible portion of the crops. For crops that were in or near flooded areas but where floodwaters did not contact the edible portion of the crops, the growers should evaluate the safety of the crops for human consumption on a case-by-case basis for possible adulteration. So with that being said, you're going to have particular SOPs you need to write, for our PCQI community out there of how you're going to handle those. We encourage growers to work with state regulators and local FDA offices to assess their unique situation and to take into consideration all possible types and routes of contamination from floodwaters in determining whether a particular crop is adulterated. So on this one, when doing an audit, you're going to have this register basically of list of those contacts, their phone numbers and addresses, and email addresses. So some of it during our audit, we take a look at those registers to make sure they're current. So in the event something happened, you're not scrambling and trying to figure out who you're going to contact. So prepare those, okay? Now there's some factors to consider in terms of evaluation that may include assessment of the floodwaters. Obviously, you're going to be working with the state agencies or any applicable agency at this point. Floodwaters may have been exposed to sewage, chemical heavy metals, pathogenic microorganisms, or other contaminants. In addition, there may have been localized catastrophes such as petroleum leak, chemical spills, or other disasters due to flooding. Therefore, knowledge of the sources of floodwaters and any possible upstream contributors of human pathogens and or chemical contaminants will help evaluate the likelihood of crop contamination by floodwaters. So during the audit, if you are a GFSI certified, this is going to be part of your crisis management program that we're going to end up asking or taking a look at to make sure we have these provisions in your procedures, especially for your business continuity plan, as well as handling these type of crises when they occur, or hopefully they don't, but if they occur. Now type of crops and stage of growth, which is one of the reference 2.8 of the document. Likelihood of contamination may be low if the edible portion of the crop has developed after the floodwater receded. The lowest edible portion of the crop was edible above the floodwaters level with minimum risk of contamination due to splashing. And the crop can be harvested without cross-contamination from nearby environment, including flooded soil and flooded portion of the crop. Now, likelihood for crops to absorb or internalize potential contaminants from floodwaters and or flooded soil, right? Says, although limited information is available regarding the likelihood and the extent for the food crop to internalize potential contaminants from floodwaters and or flooded soil, research on plant uptake of contaminants from soil suggests that uptake is likely and the rate of uptake can vary depending on many factors, including contaminants type, plant species, and soil conditions. Okay? So degree and durations of crop exposure to floodwaters and related conditions. The potential impact of flooding of food crops is likely to be dependent on the degree and durations of crop exposure to floodwaters. For example, the volumes of floodwaters, how deep and how long the floodwaters were present in the field before receding, how quickly the field began to dry out after floodwaters receded, taking into consideration soil type, topography, and drainage, whether condition exceeded the exposed crops to prolonged periods of moisture and stress which could foster fungal growth and possibly development of mycotoxins. Now, there is some testing in the guidelines. So let me read the comment. So FDA recommends that depending on the result of the assessment described above, under Section B, the growers consider testing any one or more of the following contaminants as needed, determining the suitability for human food use. Sampling should be representative of the crop being evaluated and testing appropriate for the specific crop and flood situation. FDA recommends that growers discuss their testing plan with the state and local FDA regulators and technical specialists for case-specific evaluations. So on this one, start preparing these procedures, as draft, for your process, and as a PCQI, take a look at the viability of those SOPs. Make sure your team looks at them and start communicating these, and also look at the guidance for these procedures, so you could have them, and then referring back to the register. For your contact with the state regulators and local FDA regulators, as well as your technical specialist. Now, on the contaminants, they've included, a lot of the area from mycotoxins, including aflatoxins, and all other aspects of toxins. There's a lot of them here. They've also included heavy metals, and I'm going to put these on the list on the description, for you. Pesticide that are also concerned because of the flooding issues, and PCBs and other contaminants. And then there's a lot of additional information for the food contaminants and adulteration links that the FDA provided with these guidelines, which I'll include on the description. And then the assessment of flood-affected fields before replanting. They also have the recommendation. Basically, it says FDA recommends not replanting in flooded fields if floodwaters have not receded and the soil has not sufficiently dried. And there's a complete different guidance for that, okay? Which basically all of your assessment to make a determination in allowing the soil to dry, and sampling requirements or recommendations from previously flooded soil for the presence of microorganisms that is of significant public health concern, okay? And there's a waiting period before growers can replant, depends on condition, such as temperature, weather, and soil type. And then they have commented on additional controls to avoid cross-contamination after flooding, okay? And with that being said, they've also listed additional resources from FDA and university studies and references. So with that being said, PCQI, let me end the video. I'll include all the links that are on this guideline, including this guide for your review, should you wish to take a look at it in assessing your SOPs or your procedures, and also to make your crisis management program a little bit more robust to include these if this is in your category on your food safety codes. Anyways, thank you, PCQI. Have a great evening. Till then, have a good one. Bye. Contact us. And don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. Thanks again, PCQIs. Have a good one.